being here today. This webinar is part of the Center for Bioengineering and Biotechnology's KITE training program in global biomedical technology research and innovation. Our KITE program is the first, needs first graduate program in Canada in which trainees learn to directly interact with end users and stakeholders to co-discover technology problems and solutions to improve people's health. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. I am Kenrick Vassell, Program Coordinator for KITE, and it is my pleasure to be hosting today's proceedings. I will begin with a territorial acknowledgement. Much of our work at the University of Waterloo takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building. The title of today's webinar is Pathways to Successful Academic Collaboration. The webinar will be presented by an esteemed member of our KITE team, Dr. Lora Giangregorio, who is one of the co-grantees of this KITE training program. Dr. Giangregorio is a professor in the Department of Kinesiology at the University of Waterloo and a Schlegel Research Chair in Mobility and Aging. She leads the Bone Health and Exercise Science Lab, the aptly termed Bones Lab, which studies how to prevent osteoporotic fractures via risk assessment and physical activity interventions. She is a member of the Scientific Advisory Council for Osteoporosis Canada, with whom she collaborates on initiatives to improve patient and healthcare provider education related to physical activity and exercise. Professor Giangregorio was on the leadership team that developed the Canadian 24-hour movement guidelines and is leading the exercise working group for the update to Osteoporosis Canada's 2021 clinical practice guidelines for the management of osteoporosis. Thank you very much, Professor Giangregorio, for being with us today. And with that, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thanks very much for having me today. I'm honored to present for you, and I'm going to stop my video during the talk just because it's a little distracting for me to watch myself talk, if that's okay with everybody, but I'll turn it back on at the end to answer questions. Okay, so if we think, the talk today is about collaboration, and if we think about the process of research and we think about collaboration, we often have this abstract view of, sort of people having discussions or around a table, but the pragmatics of collaboration and how to involve stakeholders in collaboration is harder to define. And so what I wanted to do today was talk about research and the different stages of research and how we can collaborate with a wide variety of people along that journey. And I've tried to gear it more towards the journey that a trainee might have, but it's also applicable to any researcher at any stage of career. So if you think about when, as a trainee, you start your thesis, or as a researcher, when you start to define a project, there are a number of stages throughout that journey. Who's leading the research, defining the team, defining the problem that you're going to address, the research question, the hypotheses, the methods, and then you usually have to get your team to approve that plan, or you have to do a thesis proposal. You then collect and analyze and interpret the data, and then you have another process of approval, and then you usually do academic dissemination, which is publishing or presenting. Some people will take another step and do dissemination or translation. And throughout that, in a traditional academic setting, you might have input from your supervisor, from your committee, lab members you're collaborating with, or even other researchers you're collaborating with. And I want to talk a little bit about how we might broaden that group, but also at what stages they provide input. So if we think about what collaboration in academia often looks like, especially from the perspective of a trainee, is that there's a bit of a hierarchy. So we have you and your lab members and research staff, and then you usually have to get approval from a thesis committee or a supervisor. And there is a clear hierarchy and clear expectations for what you need to achieve for your project or your thesis. And even if you are an early career researcher or an established researcher, you still have a bit of a hierarchy when it comes to the project in terms of kind of who's leading and makes decisions and other people who are kind of providing input. So the advantage of something like this is that you have a concentration of skills and expertise in one or a fairly narrow group of people in terms of their discipline. And so you can learn a lot and you can really be immersed in a discipline and learn a lot about it. And there are fewer relationships and opinions to manage. And usually you have a small number of projects or discrete projects. So they're very clear when it comes to sort of the scope and the timeline. When it comes to multidisciplinary collaboration in academia, there's pros and cons, and some of the pros are that you can have a much more diverse range of perspectives. So you can get perspectives from knowledge user collaborators, other stakeholders. You can involve people from other disciplines. And if you involve people who are going to use the research, it's quite likely that the research will then have more real world usability. And you also have the potential to influence larger and broader audiences. In being involved in a larger group of people often means you can then develop a network and leadership skills and potentially can be involved in more work and other projects. But that can also be a con because often the research goes in directions you weren't expecting. It may end up taking longer and you have a lot of people and opinions and relationships to manage. So there are some cons to it as well. And I want to kind of go through some of those benefits and the pros and cons today as well. The other thing to think about is some of the other benefits that are not just the on paper benefits. It is more fun to collaborate in research than to do it by yourself. Sometimes you can develop lifelong colleagues and friends, inviting people to collaborate with you. And even if it's just, that other grad student you met at the bar, not at the bar now because we're not, certainly going to bars right now, but, or even at, out for lunch or at a session like this, if you interact with people and you start to have ideas, if you collaborate on a project, you can have a little bit of fun together and you can learn from and mentor each other. It's also good for your CV. I mean, if you are working on a project and you have a friend that's in your grad program, but in a different discipline perhaps, but they have some ideas on how to make your research better and you collaborate and you put their name on your project and then they find a way for you to collaborate with them, and then you can have more collaborative publications. It needs to be authentic and it needs to follow authorship rules. I'm certainly not suggesting people put names on each other's papers to get more papers. That's not a good idea. But there is opportunity for you to think about how you can work with the people around you. Ultimately, having that broader network will lead to new training and job opportunities and help you better understand how to do collaborative research. So I'll give you an example from my experience. When I did my PhD many, many years ago, the focus was on bone health in people with spinal cord injury and rehab interventions. And the research group I was working with, worked on several projects, and the result for me was 6 peer-reviewed scientific publications. However, during that time, I built collaborations with other researchers and mentors. So I actually identified other mentors to learn from other disciplines. And because of those side projects and collaborations, there were 3 other peer-reviewed scientific publications that resulted during my PhD. But more importantly, I learned about opportunities for postdoctoral fellowships and ended up doing a postdoc with one of those mentors that I never would have done had I not established that collaboration. Moreover, I still collaborate with those 4 people to this day, and I would consider them my friends as well as my collaborators. So you can have a lot of fun in addition to making your research better. And so if we think about sort of the stages, you now start to think about, okay, well, who should I collaborate with and what can they help me with and when do I ask them and at what stages should I involve them? It can be a little bit more complicated than the traditional approach to research. So what I would encourage you to do is to break your research down up into stages. And so again, I've got some of the stages here. You can use other ones if you wish to, but if you break it down into these stages and think about at each stage, what methods would I use, and what resources, skills, or perspectives do I need? And am I doing one project, or are there several projects that could be embedded in this process to answer the question that I'm trying to answer? And the most important thing is to think about who is the research about, or who will use the research, and can I involve them at some level, or people that represent them in determining what my research question should be, or in other aspects of the process. So what I want to do is I want to actually break this down into each of these sections and go through some examples of how you might involve people and who you might involve. So let's start with who's leading the research. So inevitably, we think that researchers are leading the research, but there are many examples where researchers can partner with others to lead the research, or others direct the research and the researcher simply helps out. So that's common in working with industry partners, where an industry partner or even a policy or decision maker might have a question they want to answer, and they reach out to researchers in the field to help them lead that research. So in fact, the research is not being directed by the researcher, by the other partner. There are also examples where, say, for example, a basic science researcher wants to take their research to the next level and do a clinical trial, but they don't know how to do that. So they lead a project with a clinical trialist, so that you're co-leading with another researcher in another discipline. There are ways of doing research with Indigenous groups or individuals, and I don't profess to be an expert in that because that's not something I've done. But certainly there are guidelines for research involving those people, Indigenous groups or individuals, and the CHR guidelines for research involving Aboriginal people I've just linked to there. But importantly, if you're thinking about that research, you should not do research about people without them. So I think that's an important thing to think about, and that is true also for research, in clinical research in particular, involving patient groups. I would highly encourage you to think about how you can involve patient voices in that type of research as well. So that's the who's leading the research stage. Then we get to defining the problem. So when I talk about a problem, I talk about the big picture thing that you're addressing with your research. So it could be the issue of falls in older adults. I want to solve that problem, or I want to solve the problem of obesity or genetics related to obesity, or I want to solve the problem of, let's say that the technology for using ultrasound to image arteries is not ideal, and I want to solve that problem. So there's lots of different types of problems you can solve. And you need to be able to define and understand that problem before you start to develop research projects and hypotheses. So the way our team defines the problem, we use 3 different methods. One of them is just literature search, and most of you, I would probably expect, would use that method. There's informal ways to do literature searches, and there's also formal ways to do literature searches, like a systematic review or a scoping review or a meta-analysis. So you might consider, as you do that, should I involve a librarian in the process? Should I collaborate with a librarian to do a better job with my literature search to define what is known about the problem? Or should I involve, patient partners or healthcare providers in understanding what things I should search for? The other method we use is to understand knowledge users' perspective. So what is important to them, or what is their experience, or what are their needs or preferences or barriers? And so we do that often. And for that, we use qualitative research, although you could also use survey research and other types of methods. So that's another way to define the problem. And the third method might be to use existing data. So if you wanted to, for example, one example of a project that we did was we wanted to address the problem of hip fractures and other types of osteoporotic fractures in long-term care. But we really wanted to understand, how common that was, but also, were people who had hip fractures, were they actually on osteoporosis medication, or was that a care gap? Were they not getting prescribed medication? And so we actually reached out to public health researchers and epidemiologists who had access to data from people in long-term care and worked with them to develop research questions and analyze the data to be able to define how common this problem was. And subsequent to that, when we discovered it was a problem, you collaborated with them on developing a risk screening tool to decide who should get medication and who should get other types of therapies. So there's lots of ways to define the problem and lots of people you can collaborate with along the way. The next stage, once we know what the problem is, we want to start to develop our hypotheses or develop our research questions and the associated methodology. And when I break down a research question, I usually think of it in terms of there's a framework called PICO, or population, intervention, comparator, and outcome. And some people will add study design or time to the end of that, and others will replace intervention with exposure. So if you're doing an observational study where you're not doing an intervention, but you want to look at the effects of an exposure, you can replace that. And so when we're doing this, defining the research and the methods, we can think about who we can collaborate along the way. And we start with population. We need to define who it is that we're actually studying and who will we recruit. And we might want to work with people who can help us think about equity or how representative our research is. We want to think about things like, who should we include or exclude? So, for example, in working with clinicians, if I wanted to do a study in people with osteoporosis, and I've done this in the past, and we try to decide, okay, well, are there people we should exclude? And they might say, okay, well, I would exclude people who have clinically significant liver or kidney disease, because the type of osteoporosis they have is different. The metabolic nature of the osteoporosis is different. So I would exclude those people. But that's not something I might know as a researcher. So working with healthcare providers and defining the population can be really helpful. The other thing to think about is the logistics of actually recruiting people. So a patient group or advocacy organization or other people in your network or even healthcare providers can help you develop strategies for recruiting those people or even help you recruit them. So, involving them early to help define the questions and the strategies for recruitment can be really helpful. The other thing to think about is who will deliver your intervention and what their needs and preferences are. So one example might be if you were designing a walker for people who are at risk of falls because you wanted to do a better job compared to the existing walkers. You might think, okay, well, an occupational therapist is the person who assesses people for walkers and prescribes walkers. So maybe I should get their perspective on some of the challenges with using walkers or what user needs are, or even the people themselves, the people who use the walkers. So it may be important to involve them in the design of the intervention and the types of research around that intervention. Another thing that people don't often think about is the comparator. So this is like the control group. So let's say I have an intervention and it's an exercise intervention, and I want to have a control group. We want to know sort of what is the standard of care. So what at minimum do I have to provide to that person? And a clinician can help you define that. An ethicist might help you determine if the comparator is ethical. The other thing to think about is if you have an intervention where it's hard to blind people. So in exercise research, you know whether you've been randomized to the exercise of the control group because you're exercising or not, right? And what we've learned is that sometimes if people sign up for a study because they really want the exercise intervention, they're quite disappointed when they get randomized to control and they might drop out, or they might seek exercise elsewhere, which is then a form of contamination. So how do we design a comparator that will prevent those from happening? And we've had some really great discussions with patient partners to design comparators that really can address that issue. So having an an attention control, or even an active control that like an exercise intervention that is lower intensity or very different and not likely to have an effect on the outcomes we're interested in. So working with people in designing the comparator can be really helpful as well. When you design a study, you're usually measuring, an outcome. So something that you're interested in, like the dependent variable. So you might look at, say someone's looking at, I'm making up scenarios here. Let's say someone is trying to optimize the use of ultrasound for measuring how fast red blood cells are moving. I don't know. And so my interest as a researcher, well, not mine, but the person's interest is to look at the speed of red blood cells or how they move around, right? But maybe a user, like an ultrasound tech, would be more interested in the usability of my new ultrasound analysis technique or my new technology. And so maybe as a secondary outcome, I should also measure usability. But I might not, as a ultrasound technology engineer person, have the expertise to understand how to assess usability. So can I collaborate with a person who's a usability expert to be able to design my study so that I can look at both of those things? Or perhaps down the road, there's going to be a concern about the cost of my new technology. So perhaps I want to involve a health economist to kind of cost out. Does it take longer to do my assessment, and therefore is it going to cost more to the healthcare system? So do I involve them and at what stage to help design the outcomes for my study? And finally, the study design itself requires certain expertise. So if I'm a basic scientist and I want to do a clinical trial, do I need to recruit a collaborator that knows how to do that? Or let's say I just want to get to the pilot feasibility or proof of concept stage. Do I want someone who has expertise in doing pilot and feasibility studies specifically? Do I want to involve an ethicist to make sure that the design is meeting all of our standards? So there's a number of people you can recruit to involve at the stage of designing the hypotheses and the research questions and even the methodology. The next stage in our research is data collection, analysis, and interpretation. And there are experts that we can involve, or partners or other stakeholders that we can involve in that process. So things like data management, how to, if you have a large data set, how to manage that data, how to deal with missing data, how to make sure that we're meeting privacy standards, and those sorts of things. So there's lots of people for whom that's their expertise. Even collecting the data. So if you're designing a qualitative study, there are steps in how you do those types of studies, but also how you collect the data and how you analyze them, that you may need that expertise. In other types of analyses might require a biostatistician. So a lot of the clinical trials that we do, we would have a biostatistician collaborator on the project to help us define how we do our analyses so that we do it in the best way possible. And usually we define those a priori, which means we have to involve the statistician at the start, right when we write the grant, right when we submit the grant, when we design the protocol, because we do those in advance. We don't design our statistical analysis after we've collected the data. And then the other aspect is interpreting the data. So you want to be able to interpret the results as a researcher, but it may also be important to think what the results mean to a policymaker, to a healthcare provider, to a person who's living with a disease that you're studying. And sometimes involving them in the analysis, or at least presenting the analysis to them and saying, what does this mean to you? Or what other questions do you have? Because the way you present it in your paper may actually influence how people interpret it and how it's used. So I have an example. So this was a project that we did where we wanted to design a physical activity screening tool for primary care providers to use and to help have a conversation about physical activity. And we wanted to adapt it for use in the electronic medical record. So we wanted to actually have it be like an EMR tool that people could use. And there were examples of ways to do that, but we were not sure that that was the right way to go. So we wanted to know, should we go with this line of questioning, or should we design a new tool? And so we did a series, we did both qualitative project and a quantitative project to get a sense for what the barriers were to talking about physical activity, what people currently were using, and then we said, this is a way that's been suggested. What do you think about this? And then we did some other data collection. And I'll point out that the collaborators on this project, so 3 of the collaborators are patient partners. 3 of them were primary care providers, and 1 of them was a specialist. So we actually involved them as authors. We involved them from the beginning, and we actually collected a bunch of qualitative data on those things that I mentioned, and we shared the raw data with the patient partners. And we said, this is what people are saying. What do you think about this? And we were doing a qualitative analysis called thematic analysis, where we actually had to come up with themes that the results were actually themes. This is what people are saying. And one of the patients said something that was so impactful that it actually became the overarching theme that emerged from the research. And it was that there's this tension between the convenience for the clinician and the recognition that you need the time to make a difference in people's lives. And that was the overarching theme that emerged from the research. And then we had a number of things that came out that all aligned with that and helped us design a new tool that was more patient-centered, which we then published. So just an example of how you can actually involve people in the interpretation of your research and not just sort of, getting their input later on. So once you've done your study, or maybe once you've designed your study, you usually have to present it to your team and get approval. Or if you're a student, you do a thesis proposal or a thesis defense, and you usually get input on what are the limitations in my research and how can we interpret this? Or people say, well, have you thought about looking at this? Or did you collect data on this? And ultimately, how can you use the information to determine the next steps in your research or the next steps that other people should do? And this is a really useful process, both from a teaching perspective to train future researchers, but also to help define future research projects that should emerge and how to write your discussion section in a paper. When you're doing collaborative research, you have more people involved, which means you have more voices when it comes to data collection, data analysis, data interpretation, how we can use this data. And so you need to think carefully about how to navigate that collaboration and those discussions. And because there may be disagreements, there may be some people that think you need to do it one way and others that think you need to do it another way. And so my suggestion is that you think about in advance how your team is going to communicate. And we've even gone so far as to come up with a charter for collaboration. And we did that so that we could outline to people, how things would happen, but also to make it clear to our partners that they could be involved however they wish to, rather than saying you have to attend every single meeting and you have to do this. We would say, this is how we're going to communicate with you. And you can choose to communicate this way, or you can choose to communicate in other ways. And when you make suggestions, we really want to hear them. So to make it very clear that we are open to your suggestions and we are open to your voice on how we should do things. And when there's a disagreement, this is how we're going to resolve it. So it's very clear up front how things will happen. So just thinking about the fact that this is going to happen and how you're going to deal with it is an important step if you are going to collaborate with a large group of people. Your next phase is academic dissemination. So this is the publishing your paper in a journal or presenting it at a conference. And you need to think about who is the audience that you want to disseminate it to. What types of papers do they read, or what conferences do they go to? Is it important for me that the research is open access? And how do I make sure that that happens or not if it's not important? And so the knowledge users can actually help you choose journals that might be important or conferences that they think you should present it to that you may not have thought of. And also there are things like reporting guidelines. So I know for clinical trials, there's Consort. For systematic reviews, there's Prisma. I believe there's also reporting guidelines for basic science studies and for observational studies. Strobe, I think, is one of them. So if there are reporting guidelines, I highly recommend that you look them up and use them. Because one, they'll make your paper more rigorous because it'll tell you the things you probably should be reporting on so that other people don't criticize you later for not reporting on those things. But also it may give you a broader perspective on how this type of research should be done. And in fact, you might even read it through before you start your research to make sure you've collected all the things that people expect you to report on later. The other thing that I find really helpful when I'm working with a team of diverse people, and even with students, is at the very start in designing a project, I like to think about what deliverables are going to come out of this project. So are we going to have presentations? Are we going to have papers? Are we going to come up with other types of things? And define in advance what the authorship guidelines will be. So we had a clinical trial that we were doing, and we said, the primary research question is this, and that will result in one paper. Then we're going to have another paper, one or more papers that have from the secondary objectives. And our rules are that if you meet the ICAMJE authorship guidelines, which I've linked to below, you will be an author on these papers. And we're going to do authorship in alphabetical order. And the exception is that all trainees get to be first author, and the senior author, which would be me, because in that instance, will be last author, but everybody else is alphabetical order. Or you can decide on some other order. But the point is that we kind of set up front, these are the papers we're going to publish, and this is how authorship is going to work. Do you have any concerns about that? So that everybody knows what they need to do to be an author, and also where they stand. Because that may influence the amount of participation they have, or whether they want to participate at all. So in that process, we discovered, one author, he said, well, can we do alphabetical for the first paper and then reverse alphabetical for the second one? And I said, that sounds reasonable, and everyone agreed, right? And so having authorship guidelines up front, especially for a large project where there's going to be multiple papers or where it's not clear, can be really helpful. You may also think about the plan to ensure that people read your work. So just putting it out there doesn't mean people are going to read it. So if you really want to get your research out there, you might think about sharing it with your collaborators, saying, here's the PDF of our paper, share it. Or I've seen people actually target people in the field where they say, I know I've published this study, and I really think that these are the leaders in the field, and I'm going to share my research with them. Or sharing it with funding organizations, or sharing it with community advocacy or regulatory organizations, or other people who may be interested in it. You may even have a social media strategy for sharing the research that you've done. And this is where you could collaborate with people in marketing, communications, and information technology. And some organizations will do that to make sure that their research gets out there. I'm not suggesting that everyone do that, but some groups have funding in their grant to develop a communications plan for the research. So there's lots of people you can collaborate with in the academic dissemination of your work. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I created this flowchart because a lot of trainees will ask me, what journal should I submit to? Because there's so many journals out there. And so I created this flowchart to answer this question. And the primary thing to think about is who is your audience and what would they read? But there's a number of other things you may want to consider. And ultimately, you want to have a list of potential journals and select the one that strikes the best balance between being a good journal and also a realistic chance of acceptance, so that you're not reformatting it and resubmitting it multiple times. The other thing is that the more you submit it, the more chances that you're going to get a repeat reviewer, because they ask experts in the field to review. So it's it's happened to me where I've reviewed a paper for one journal and rejected it, and then got sent it from another journal to review. And so you want to avoid that happening because the chances of rejection are much higher. So you don't want to submit to too many journals. So you kind of want to find a nice sweet spot, so you only have to submit it once or twice and then it gets published. So don't aim too high if you don't think it's going to be accepted, I guess is what I'm saying. So striking that balance. And so this is a tool that I'm happy to share if anyone would like to use it. And then the next stage after academic dissemination is broader dissemination or knowledge translation. Not everybody takes this step, but if you choose to do so, the field of implementation science is its own field of research. And this is the field where we try to look at how do we actually move research into practice in the real world, or how do we get people to use research. And CHR uses the knowledge to action cycle as sort of a framework for helping people understand how to do that. And some of the steps are sort of understanding, what research is there and what is the gap, like defining the gap of research to practice. So for example, we have physical activity guidelines. We know how active people should be to maintain their health. But when we look at how active people are, we see that they're not active. And we see that, maybe healthcare providers aren't recommend using the guidelines. And that's a gap. So how do we address that gap? We have to define our audience. Who is it? Is it the patient? Is it the person living in the community? Is it a healthcare provider? Is it exercise providers? Is it public health specialists? It may be all of them, but maybe you want to narrow it down. And then what is the context, and can we adapt the research to their context? And then we want to understand the barriers to using that information and use that information to select and tailor interventions. And there's more aspects to the knowledge to action cycle, but those are some of them. So you may want to collaborate with knowledge translation researchers or implementation scientists to develop strategies, and this can actually be its own research. So this is another way of kind of expanding your collaboration, is to learn how to do this, or at least work with people who know how to do this. So the group of people that we can collaborate with in our research is quite broad. And I've tried to give examples of how you can collaborate with all of these people. And it's not to say that every project has to involve a representative from each of these people, but more so that you think about from the beginning who maybe you might want to involve in your research. And think locally, nationally, and internationally, because there is potential if you for some research to have international collaborators, and why not, right? And I've highlighted the two in darker green because, if you're doing any research that has, translational or clinical or implementation science application, you really want to consider involving the people that the research is about. There's also the issue of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So you want to think about whether or not the people, the research that you're doing research about is generalizable or inclusive of as many people as possible. So is the inclusion exclusion criteria so restrictive that you're not going to represent certain groups? Or perhaps you need to target certain groups. So in qualitative research, they might do something called purposeful sampling, where I know that often the people who will sign up for my study, in osteoporosis, will be white postmenopausal females. So I may have to have strategies for purposeful sampling of males. Or I may need to have strategies for purposeful sampling of people who live in rural areas because I live in an urban one, and therefore it's easier for me to recruit urban people. So that would be one example. Another example is who is represented on your research team. So if you are a research team of young people, but you're doing research about older adults, should your research team be more diverse? So should you include an older adult on your research team so that you have more representation especially of the people that you are studying? And in your dissemination plan, when you think about disseminating your research more broadly, does your plan include strategies that will target a diverse group of people? So for example, if my dissemination strategy is to use social media, and my research is about people who live rurally, who are older and maybe don't use social media as much, then I may not reach the people that I'm trying to reach. So thinking about, there's a number of tools you can use to learn more about what you should think about. One of them is Progress Plus. And I placed the link there, and it gives you the categories of things you might want to think about, and even collect these data at minimum. So when we do a clinical trial, we will ask questions, where people live, what their ethnicity is, what language do they speak, what their occupation was. So we can actually document that in our studies to see, when we describe our population, we can say, look, this is who our population represents, so that people can understand who it does and who it doesn't. And the other tool is a new tool around intersectionality and knowledge translation, because many of these categories can actually intersect, right? So if a person is female and has a disability and is a person of color, they may be at a very specific, they may have a very specific experience of our healthcare system compared to someone who is a person of color but doesn't have a disability or have other characteristics. So the intersection of some of those categories can actually influence a person's experience or may influence their inclusion in research and that sort of thing. And so there's a link there to a tool that might help you think about some of those factors as well. And from a pragmatic perspective, you could even just ask your team to say, hey, here's this, in this toolkit, here are all the factors that may influence our perspective. Just reflect on that as, you know, and what your perspective is, and so that we know which perspectives are missing. So it's not to say you have to include someone from every single category, but more so that you understand what is represented and what isn't, and how that might bias your perspectives. There's a whole lecture just on that topic, but that just something to think about. Anyway, moving on to thinking about how to identify and contact collaborators. This is more the pragmatics of, okay, fine, I want to involve other people. How do I do that, and how do I talk to them? So there's a number of strategies that we've used. And one is to create our own network. So we have, every time I go and give a talk in the community, or you know, to healthcare providers or to patients, I will say, you know, we have an email list where we send out information about events that we're doing, education events, or opportunities to participate in research. If you'd like to be contacted on, you know, just send us an email. And so we have an email list. And every time we do a research study, we send out an email to that list and say, hey, we're doing this study and this is what it's about. You can identify communication strategies or networks that you can link to. So the University of Waterloo actually has people whose job it is to help you collaborate with stakeholders. And so identify, become friends with those people and understand how, you know, they can help you identify people that you might want to collaborate with. Or understand, you know, maybe there are networks of people. So we've worked with the Research Institute for Aging to identify more broadly people that we might want to collaborate with. You can advertise. If you are looking for, so I've seen advertisements, CHRs put out advertisements. We want older adult representatives to be on this panel to help advise this research strategy. So people will put out advertisements for this sort of thing. When you do reach out to people, do your homework. Understand, so for example, if I am going to reach out to a policymaker to ask them if they'd like to be involved in my research, or an organization, I'm going to do my research and I'm going to read, what is the mission statement of that organization? What are the activities they're currently involved in? Do they do their own research? Do they fund research? Do they, do they have a sort of strategic plan for the next 5 years? And how does my research fit with that? And so that I can have an intelligent conversation with them and know that I know what they're all about. And then when I send my invitation, I can say, you know, this is who I am and this is what I'm doing and this is, you know, how I'd like you to be involved. And I think this would really align with your strategic plan and whatever. But you have to actually provide specifics. So just do your homework and know who you're asking and what they're all about. And finally, think about whether or not there are nonprofit organizations or advocacy, regulatory, or community organizations that represent the people that you're interested in working with, because they may be able to help you recruit partners or even recruit participants in studies if you're looking for people that they represent. And when you go to do your ask, make it short and make it clear. So big long request. As soon as I see an email with a big long thing in it, I get really stressed out. So really short and sweet, as short as possible. Spend your time composing the email so that it's concise. Identify who you are, what your goal is, or your project. You can append a summary, so you can say, I'm doing a project on this topic, summary attached if they want to learn more information, or you could summary below, which I find really helpful because then they don't have to open up a new document. So I'll put it at the bottom of the email. And, you know, I think you'd be really interested because X, Y, and Z, so why should they care? I'm interested in collaborating with you and having you do X, Y, and Z on my project. That's not the right way to word it. Basically helping them understand what you're asking of them. So are you asking them to be a participant and attend every single meeting and be very intimately involved in the research, or are you just asking for them to endorse the research and maybe give you input on the dissemination, help with the dissemination at the end? So there's a variety of ways people can be involved. So make it clear what you're asking of them and the time commitment, because that will also often influence whether they say yes. And then what are the things they need to do next, and how can you make it easy for them to participate? So one example, if I'm writing a grant and I would like an organization to endorse it, to say, I think this is a great idea, and I am willing to disseminate the results at the end of the study, and I will disseminate it to my 1,000 people in my network. I might say, hi, I'm Laura, I'm doing this project, it aligns with what this is what it is, and I think it aligns with X, Y, and Z. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to write a letter of support that says these three things. I'm willing to write the letter of support, draft a letter of support for you. It is due on this date. If you have questions, please let me know. And so I'll make it very clear what I'm asking and how I'm going to make it easy for them. The other thing is, how are they being acknowledged or compensated? So if you are asking a patient partner to be involved in a year-long project, is there funding in your grant to give them an honorarium? Or are you going to include this researcher you're asking to be as a co-author? So if that's the case, make that clear in the ask, because sometimes those things will influence people's participation if they are deciding which projects they want to get involved in. So I'll give you a few examples of these types of things from our lab. One thing, and tips as well. So one thing is really understanding what's important to the knowledge user or person that you're trying to engage with. So if the research is about patients or about healthcare providers, you want to know what's important to them. There's a number of ways we have done this. So one is, whenever I give a talk in the community or elsewhere, I listen to the questions that people ask me at the end. What are the frequently asked questions? And I often use those as helping me think about what some of the gaps are and what research I should do next. We've done qualitative studies to understand people's experiences and needs and barriers. We've done surveys to understand what people think are important outcomes or what their needs are. And we've also taken the step of actually including patient advocates on our team as co-investigators. And in fact, we do that almost all the time. So one example is we did systematic reviews to identify what is known about exercise in people with osteoporosis. And then I took all the frequently asked questions and, we did a consensus process on how to answer those questions based on evidence and based on expert opinion. And we turned those into I involved international collaborators, and we turned those into an international consensus and published that work. And so we had a number of collaborators involved in that. And then from that process, now we have guidelines on what people should be doing for exercise and physical activity, but we want people to use them. So we went to specialists and primary care providers and physiotherapists and kinesiologists and patients or older adults and asked them what their barriers were to using these guidelines. And we used behavior change theory to map their responses. We did thematic analysis and we mapped their responses to interventions using the behavior change wheel. So I had to actually collaborate with people who know how to do this to be able to answer these questions. And we actually published several publications around the perspectives of these different groups on using the barriers to using guidelines. And then what we did was we used that information to develop interventions. So we developed communication tools. We developed videos for patients, one-page summary for doctors, because the main barrier they told us was time. I don't have time to talk to my patient about this and I don't know what to say. So we gave them a one-pager to facilitate conversations with patients that was freely available and that could be embedded into the EMR. We developed a booklet for patients. We developed a continuing education for exercise professionals and continuing education tools for healthcare providers like physicians and specialists. And this incorporated a number of behavior change strategies like persuasion, training, education, enablement, which I can't get into, but the bottom line is we took the barriers, we mapped them to behavior change strategies, and we used that to develop tools. And I did a look at some of the analytics, and this work was released. These interventions were released about 4 or 5 years ago. And even now, we're still getting sort of 750 downloads a month of the one-page summary and 1,200 views a month of our videos. The booklet, 420 downloads a month in the year 2020 to 2021. We've trained, well, Osteoporosis Canada has trained over 2,000 exercise professionals. So we've used these interventions to kind of translate them into and disseminate. So both disseminate and translate. Disseminate is put the knowledge out there. Translate is design things to actually change practice. Slightly different terminology. So this is an example, the front and back of the one pager that we designed for physicians, and it's got a number of behavior change strategies embedded in it. But we had, physicians, patients, other exercise professionals, graphic designers. We collaborated with lots of people to develop this type of thing. We had a grant to fund it, so I'm not expecting everybody to do this for their knowledge translation, but the idea is we could actually get a grant to do knowledge translation because we convincingly said that we have these guidelines and we need to move them to practice. Language was a barrier, so we incorporated translation into a variety of languages. So these are examples of how we can actually collaborate on knowledge translation. We also took the different components, so the systematic reviews that we've done, the patient and provider input, and information that would be convincing for a policymaker to write grants to establish the need for a clinical trial. So when you are writing a grant or even a paper or like the rationale for your paper or even like a scholarship application, you need to build a case for the need for your research and why it's important. And if you can think about it from a variety of perspectives, you can actually be more convincing. And so we've actually, used these strategies to then get funding for some of the work that we've done. And so this is, and I'm not going to go through this, it's just an example of this was a survey that we did of 1,100 members of the Canadian Osteoporosis Patient Network. And this, again, the collaborators on these are a dietitian, person with an expertise in guideline methodology, patients, healthcare providers, and primary care and specialists. So this is a variety of collaborators that designed a survey to get input from patients on what do you want to know in the next guidelines, right? So before doing the guidelines, we collaborated on a survey to figure out what people want to know in the guidelines. And from that, I included a question about what are your questions about exercise? And we learned a number of things that patients want to know. Go back to like, what are your frequently asked questions about exercise? So we did this to get a sense for what are the research gaps. And so I can then use this information to guide what my next series of projects will be. So having this patient input is really, really helpful. Another tip that I would share with you is don't assume that you know what is best when it comes to the research. And it's involving any collaborators, stakeholders from the beginning will probably have the best outcome when it comes to designing your research. So I'll give you an example. When we set out to do some of these guidelines, from the researcher's perspective, we thought the most important things, outcomes, like what we want to prevent with exercise is fractures, falls, and low bone mineral density, for example. So the study outcomes that we're interested in are, imaging of bone and fractures and falls. But when we actually asked patients, they said that the things that were most important to them were physical functioning, quality of life, premature death, and long-term care admission. So it told us that if we're going to look at guidelines or if we're going to design clinical trials, we might need to think about outcomes that also reflect those that are important to patients. And if you have the ability and resources, and by resources, I just mean mostly the time to do this right. Although it's nice if you also have some financial resources to invest as well, but is to invite the knowledge user or the collaborator to be on your team as an equal. So not just to be a patient partner who you ask stuff about or who you share with and get their approval on, but to actually involve them as a researcher in the sense that they help provide input on the research questions and what's important. And they inform you on what outcomes are important, and they help you make decisions when it comes to the analysis and interpretation and the dissemination. And not all collaborators will want to do this. So sometimes a patient is interested in being involved and giving input, but they don't want that much involvement. So it's really important to figure out how much involvement they want, and have those conversations. But if you have the opportunity to involve people, and they want to be involved, you'd be surprised at the value that they can add. And so we're working on new guidelines for Osteoporosis Canada. And we have physiotherapists, kinesiologists, primary care providers, specialists, and a patient advocate. And they've been really helpful in helping us have discussions about the outcomes and the questions, but also about, when we talk about the evidence to decision-making process, or what should the guidelines be, thinking about, patients' values and what's acceptable to them, and equity. Like, yeah, sure, it would be great if everybody could do a really structured resistance training program, but that requires expertise and equipment and resources that people may not have. So how can we think about framing the guidelines when it comes to equity? And would everybody want this? Or should we recommend it for only those people who value those things, right? So, and also in developing our dissemination tools for the guidelines, again, getting people's input on, hey, I'm doing this infographic. What are the messages that should go, and what resonates with patients? And then the value that we have experienced in getting patient and provider input is amazing. So just some examples from our team. And the other thing I'll highlight is that it seems like a lot of work, but this is really, it's almost better to take a small chunk and do it well than to try to do the large research project and not do it well. So maybe your thesis project isn't the clinical trial, but maybe it's a feasibility study or a needs assessment or a usability study rather than the whole trial. Because if you do the whole study and you do this intervention and it works sort of, but it's not usable, then it's not that useful. So if you break it down into steps, it may take longer, but it may actually be more valuable. And you can actually publish at every stage. So you can publish the systematic review, the needs assessment, the pilot study, the usability study, the full study, the guideline, and then even the studies that make up the KT plan. So as a researcher, if you want a career in academia, you could think about publishing at each stage of this process. So to summarize some of our lessons learned, what does the collaborator care about, and how can you add value? How can you engage them in a way that's meaningful for them, and make it a meaningful experience for them? And ask them how they wish to participate and be acknowledged. Some people want to be in at every meeting, and some people just want to give you input at the end. Do you want to establish how you're going to communicate, whether it's a charter of collaboration or just an informal discussion about how that's going to happen? Do you need authorship guidelines? Are there other guidelines that can guide your process? Agree on the scope and the timeline and the communication strategies and everybody's roles and responsibilities. Each step in the process can be research, and so never underestimate the value of documenting those steps, because it may be that someone else is doing very similar research to you and they would really value your needs assessment or your systematic review or your usability study. So publish it if you can, even if it's informal in a blog. And think about authentic engagement at all stages, even if it's the design of the research questions, the outcomes you choose, how to design your intervention, or the dissemination strategies. And you may involve different people at different stages. So you may not necessarily need your biostatistician at every single stage, but you might need them really during the analysis and designing the protocol. Understand the perspectives of the people on your team, as well as the people you study, and think about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And finally, there are many, many resources out there to help you, and there are mentors that, you may need to find mentors in the discipline you want to learn from. So there's no reason why you only have one supervisor mentor. You can have many mentors in your life. Your mentor could be your friend that you met at a workshop in behavior change and psych, because maybe you want to learn more from them. So you collaborate with them on a project. There's the PCORI, which is related to patient-centered outcome research that I've linked to there, as well as another CHR document that you may find helpful in this process. So with that, I will sign off. I'd like to acknowledge funding sources and institutions that I collaborate with, as well as several of the people on our team that have worked on some of the research that I talked about. And I'm happy to answer anyone's questions.
Thank you, Professor Giangregorio, for a fantastic presentation. We will now open the floor to questions. If you have a question, please click on the hand icon and I will send you a request to unmute your microphone. Or you can write your questions in the chat and I'll ask them on your behalf. Questions, comments? I think I'll start. I have a question. I'm glad that you touched on the role of social media in disseminating your research. Even when I did my PhD, it's not really an avenue that was widely used for doing that. And I noticed that you're very active on social media.
It's a bit of an addiction.
So I was just wondering, like, what strategies do you use to sort of what's your social media strategy for disseminating your own research? Like, how do you engage the various platforms effectively from your perspective?
Yeah. So I will say it's a work in progress. I actually would like to collaborate with someone who knows what they're doing, because I don't. But I like Twitter for academic discourse. I find that I notice there seems to be more academic discourse on Twitter than some of the other platforms. Although I do use, okay, so I'll start with Twitter. So with Twitter, I will, things that seem to influence uptake. One is incorporating a picture or an image or something that, some sort of media that people can interact with, links to other resources, a call to action. So, here's something you can do, or here is my opinion, what we should be doing in future. Here is a link to a study. So sharing our research, as sort of emphasis or evidence to support what I'm saying. Or asking people's opinions, because that's a good way to foster discussion. So sometimes I'll say, hey, I saw this is something, what do you guys think? And then people will respond. So if you really want to engage with people on Twitter, I think really asking questions or putting stuff out there that allows people to interact can be very effective. Talking about controversial topics. So I recently posted an article on a case study of a fracture that occurred as a result of exercise testing. And so I posted a thread about my opinions on the topic, but I also posed questions to the audience. And that then fostered a bit of conversation. Another thing to do is tag people. So I would not tag people you don't know, because that could be really annoying, unless there's a really good reason to tag them. I'd be sort of judicious about who you tag and how often you tag them. For example, if you know that there would be someone interested in the post, you could tag them, or if you want to ask their opinion, you can tag them. But be mindful of, if I'm tagging them, it kind of makes them have to respond. So do I, if I tag the same person all the time, it might get really annoying. And also if they're the type of person who appreciates that. So just walk that line very carefully. But I've often tagged people if I want to include them in the conversation. Facebook, I don't really use all that often, other than there are special interest groups on Facebook that you can use for sharing information or having conversations about topics. So two that I belong to. One is Connected Kinesiologists, because my department is kinesiology, and a lot of the stuff I do would have an impact on kinesiologists. So I belong to that group and I interact with them and I share the research with them. So it's a really great way to get our research out to practicing kinesiologists. And I also respond to queries. Another one is there's a geriatric physical therapy group. So again, because my interest is osteoporosis and falls and fractures, this is a group that is interested in physical therapy topics specific to geriatrics. So I will actually belong to that Facebook group and answer questions that are relevant to my area, or pose questions, or share the research that we do. And that's a way of kind of getting uptake of the research, is sharing it to these special interest groups on Facebook. Instagram, I find hard to have academic discourse because it's all about pictures, but I will actually post, you know, links to our studies or images from our studies that are of interest to people. But I also just post my baking and other fun things, so it's not really as well developed a platform for me for sharing research. So those would be the ones. I think I could see the utility for Discord in future if you could come up with a really good Discord group. But again, because I target older people, it's harder to get them involved in ones like that, because it's really a gaming platform that has been sort of leveraged for other things, and I don't know that my audience is on Discord. So you have to be mindful of, where is your audience? My audience will use Facebook and maybe Twitter and maybe Instagram, but not for academics. So I have to be a little bit cautious. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm sort of learning it myself because, as I said in the past, I didn't really focus on it as much, but I do recognize that it's such an important part now of engaging with a broader audience that maybe don't read the traditional scientific journals. So, yeah, no, that answers my questions.
we've also, I should say, we've also had, so we create like interest by saying, hey, in the next month, we're going to post one video a day about this topic. And we do repeated posts to kind of get people interested. And we'll post, so for this talk, I posted, you know, like, this is my talk, and then there's some things I'm going to talk about. And I did several posts. The time of day you post matters. So there's certain times of day where you get better uptake than others. You kind of have to pay attention to that. So that those would be other things I would think about, is sort of trying to entice people to pay attention. But tagging organizations can also help. So I will tag Osteoporosis Canada, I'll tag this Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology, I'll tag the Canadian Centre for Activity and Aging, GERAS Centre, a number of, if I want, you know, to interact or I want to share something with someone, I'll actually tag organizations as well. So I see there's a question in the chat, so maybe I'll answer that one. I was curious to know whether you actively consider the stage of career of your collaborators. I can see the benefits of having established researchers in your network, but I've often had really insightful comments and feedbacks from ECR. Very curious about your perspective. Yes, so yes, I absolutely do. And I often make an effort to include a variety of stages of career. So we will, I have to be a bit careful, because I selfishly would like to include, for example, my former postdocs or PhD students who have gone on to academia, but some people view that negatively. So some people will say, well, if, you know, this person is still working with their PhD supervisor, that's bad, right? From a tenure perspective, which I think is totally ridiculous. But I have to be mindful of including them, but I will think, you know, carefully about, you know, can I include early career people where possible? So a recent grant we got from CIHR, I specifically said we have these people who are senior career, these people who are middle career, these people who are junior career, and I made a conscious effort to include people at each stage, because I do think that's important, and also trainees. So I involve trainees in most of our projects. In fact, most of our projects are led by trainees. So that's also really important to me. And yeah, I do welcome that and build it into a lot of our studies.
Any more questions from the floor? Actually, I have one more question I'd like to ask since I have you here. I'm really happy that you talked about establishing clear guidelines for authorship from the very beginning of the process. But in sort of my limited experience, even if you have sort of clear guidelines, when you come to actually write the paper, you can have disputes. Have you ever experienced that, and how did you resolve those disputes?
Yeah, so that has happened. So the first thing we do, we actually have a written document when it comes to authorship guidelines. So I will circulate that document at the beginning of the project. These are the rules if you want to be an author, and this is how we're going to do things. And I don't sound as much like a dictator as I am right now, but I basically say, here's our authorship guidelines. Let us know what you think. That sort of thing. And then we will, when we're writing papers, we'll say, we're working on this paper. This is when you're going to receive your manuscript to read. You need to turn it around in this many weeks, etc. We'll send it out. And to be included as an author, you need to do these things. If someone is not kind of meeting authorship guidelines, then we do say, like, we would really like to include you on this paper, but we need you to do X, Y, and Z to do that. How much time do you need, or, can you do it by this day? We go through those processes. When it comes to disputes, the biggest thing often the dispute is around author order. So that's why I like to have rules around author order from the beginning that everyone agrees on. So for me, it's trainees first always. And they're always the first, second, third. If there's a trainee on the project, they're at the beginning. The person whose funding is allowing the project to happen is usually the senior person, and they go last. And then the rest is fairly arbitrary, right? So it's either alphabetical or it's in order of contribution. That one's tricky because then you have to value how many people have contributed. So I prefer more alphabetical, random lottery, or some other process that doesn't depend on me making value judgments of people's contributions. So that's how I would usually do it. And then what we will do is we'll actually circulate in the next, few months. These are the papers that are coming out. These are the authors that are going to be on it. Does anyone have any problems with that? This is the author order. So I will be very communicative about that, and that helps to resolve those disputes. However, I've had a scenario where a person opted out of a paper at the start, and then when it was literally accepted and we were dealing with like the response, just the editorial preprint, they were like, hey, why wasn't I included on that paper? And so we had to navigate that, and the reality was they did actually provide a lot of input all the way through. So they met authorship criteria. So I just had to get them to read the paper and provide final edits to really meet the criteria. And we talked to the editors about it, and the editors like, really? And I'm like, yeah. And I showed them correspondence, and yes, this person really was involved. We just didn't include them. So I err on the side of inclusion. And I try to make people happy, but I also will make sure that they have to meet authorship guidelines as outlined by that link I showed you. If they don't, then I can justify not including them. Very rarely does that happen, because most people, because we have very clear guidelines from the start, it's not usually an issue. It's the fact that most people don't have guidelines from the start that they have the problems later. So that would be my strong suggestion. Anytime you have more than a few authors involved, author guidelines, right from the beginning. Say, hey, I think we're going to get 3 papers out of this. This is what I envision. These are the authors. This is the order. What do you guys think? Right? Get it out of the way early, because then if someone's not included or wants to opt out, then you can take them out of the equation and don't worry about it. Or if they want to be included, then you make sure you include them in all the discussions. So that would be my answer to that. Does that answer your question?
I think that's very good advice. During my research, I didn't really work in such a structured environment when it came to authorship. It was sort of more based on value, which was determined at the end, and that, as you mentioned, can become very contentious.
Yeah, it's bad, especially with trainees, because a trainee might think they get to be first author, and then the supervisor says, no, you don't. So I don't think it's unfair to have those conversations, and everybody's in a different environment and works differently. That's how I operate, because I appreciate, especially because I work with a lot of really big groups, I don't want to get into arguments with people. So that's that. And that might be, I like structure. I'm a very structured person, and maybe other people are not. But it's not unfair to ask about it as a trainee. How does this work? And if it's not what you think it should be, then you may need to negotiate that, or negotiate like how much work you're doing, relative to that. So everyone has different opinions about how that should work. That's my opinion, and that's how it works with our team.
I think that's very good advice. Yeah, for sure.
I have here a comment. As a student, most projects have already been decided prior to starting our grad degree, even if we have our own grant. How do we communicate with collaborators that you're interested in a different project? That is a really tough one. I'm not sure if it's meant like you have a supervisor who wants you to do one project and you don't want to do it, or if it's that you want to do additional projects. So I'll try to address both of those. If you are in a lab where they have a grant or a project in mind and they want you to work on it, that's a tricky thing to navigate, because sometimes the grant is funding the studentship that you have, so you kind of have to do work related to that grant. So you have to, that's why picking a supervisor, what are the types of projects I could work on, and what are your expectations of me? Having those conversations early is really important. I think if you're stuck with a project you don't want to do, and that's what's funding you and you kind of have to do it, then you may have to sort of negotiate what you're getting out of that, and is there a side project you can do that is actually of your interest. So that would be one way around it. So that's, can you do other pieces, or can you do other things to support the project if you don't like the exact, and asking, how much influence do I have on the decision making when it comes to the projects? The other thing is that sometimes what you want to do is not feasible as a student. So I've had students come to me and be like, I want to do a clinical trial on this topic. And I'm like, well, that's great. That project will cost $1 million that we don't have. So how can we, I don't say it that way, but basically, how can, that's a really cool idea. Maybe we can back up and do some preliminary work that might inform that project that is more realistic for the scope of a master's student. So it may be having those conversations about, when I came here, I'm really interested in this work you're doing, but I'm also interested in learning X, Y, and Z skills. Can I do a side project to do that? Or can I switch projects? Is there another student that can work on this? So maybe having that conversation. If it's just that you want to work on a side project, then it's maybe talking to your supervisor about that, and about how to make that happen for you. So I've had students where, especially with COVID-19, I've had a few students where we ended up having to switch their project to something that maybe wasn't exactly what they wanted to do. So we sat down and said, okay, well, what are the things you want to learn, and how can we, you're doing this and you don't really want to do this, but what could their next steps be that might help you get the skills and things that you want to do later, and how I try to make the best of the situation. I don't know if that was really, I went all over the place there. Hopefully that answered your question, but maybe ask a follow-up if I didn't.
Want to comment on that, Alan? Okay, I think Alan seems satisfied, yeah.
And I can give you an example from my experience. Like when I was doing my PhD, my supervisor got a grant to do a project that I actually went to work with my supervisor because he was an expert in cardiac rehab. And he got a grant to do a project in spinal cord rehab and said, hey, can you work on this? And so I was very agreeable, maybe a little naive, but it's like, yeah, sure, I could do that, So I launched into this area that I knew nothing about, and, did this project. And the challenge was that it was sort of being led by other people, and I kind of had to do it the way they wanted it done. So I made the best of it. And I just tried to inject as much of my input and design as I could, but, I don't want to make it sound like it was a great project and I learned a lot from it. And it's not that I didn't want to do it, but I also wanted to learn more. I met someone else who was in a different discipline, was not working with my supervisor, and started working with her on other projects on the side. And ended up doing a separate project because I wanted to learn some new skills, and did that separate project. And it was a small project. We ended up publishing it, but so I sought out this other opportunity to kind of satisfy my need to learn in this discipline, which ended up being really good because it directed a lot of the stuff I did in future. And I think it's also, you know, when you're seeking out supervisors for your future, don't be afraid to ask, what kind of projects are your students working on now? Can you give me some examples? What projects do you see me working on? Do you have any grants that you can see me working on? How much do I have to come up with my own idea for my thesis, or is it something that you and I decide on together? Does it have to be in a certain area, right? Like asking those questions is I actually appreciate when students, because it sounds like they're actually invested in making decisions around what they want to do. So I wouldn't shy away from those if you're seeking out new environments. I would go to I've actually connected people with my grad students and said, can you talk to this person? Because that way my grad students can give them the frank account about what it's like to work in my lab without me there. And, you know, they can decide if that's the type of lab they want to be in, right?
More questions?
I mean, and if there are no questions, I actually have a question for the audience. I'm curious because I've not presented this exact presentation before, and I'm curious to know if there are specific messages or things that people got out of it that they really valued, or things that they wanted to learn that they didn't learn in this presentation, so I can think about it for future. Like, so what did you like about it, and what were you wishing for that you didn't get?
Yeah, and we have reflection forms too that the CREATE trainees produce at the end of each talk. So I can certainly share those with you as well. You know, where they'll make comments on the talk, on the webinar.
Okay, great.
And give feedback. Or you can give feedback in the chat right now as well.
Sure.
And just to remind CREATE trainees that the video for this talk will be posted to Learn as well as the slides. So you'll have a chance to visit the links that were presented and to catch up on anything that you may have missed.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for a captivating lecture and discussion. Really appreciate it. And for answering all the questions, even though we've gone a bit over time. Everybody who attended, thank you for attending. Our next webinar in the CREATE program will be on the 14th of June. Hope to see you all there, and everybody stay safe and enjoy the good summer weather.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.